Students of Reddit who had an intimate relationship with a teacher. How did it start? He was a professor at my university, exactly twice my age, something I had fantasized about for years until our relationship shattered that illusion. One night, we happened to attend the same concert. A couple of days later, he invited me out for coffee to talk about music. When I arrived, he greeted me with a European-style kiss on the cheeks and joked, "Maybe that's a little forward for a first date?" I hadn't even considered it a date until that moment, but it was exactly what I wanted to hear. By the end of the night, he was tapping me in a public park, with fingers. That was almost 10 years ago, and if I could go back in time, I'd punch myself in the face for being so stupid. A couple days later, I blew his whistle in his office, and a couple days after that he drove me to his apartment so we could jump on the bed. It was my first time for everything. I was completely consumed by the thrill of our forbidden relationship, the excitement of being with a much older man who seemed utterly infatuated with me. We would steal moments in empty hallways on campus and make out, or have silent, desperate banging session in his office in the middle of the day. We were together in secret for a few months until my parents found out, and all hell broke loose. He would have lost his job if I hadn't lied to the administration to protect him. Despite everything, we stayed together for another 6 months, until I finally woke up. Nothing was changing, and I was tearing apart my relationship with my parents for someone who didn't truly care about me. So I ended it. It was an unhealthy and toxic relationship. He was manipulative, dismissive, and dishonest about nearly everything. Anytime I expressed personal aspirations that didn't align with his vision, he mocked or dismissed them. Whenever I tried to discuss important matters, like navigating my relationship with my parents, the university, or even his own family, he would shut me down with anger and verbal outbursts to avoid the conversation. At one point, he even gave me a cheap engagement ring, and I actually accepted it, something I still can't believe. He violated my trust in deeply hurtful ways, sharing private photos of me with strangers and speaking about me to his non-university friends in degrading ways. When he realized how inexperienced I was during intimate times, he frequently compared me to other women he had been with, making me feel small and inadequate. More than anything, he wanted someone who would idolize him and fight for his attention. And for far too long, that's exactly what I became. My long-standing suspicions about his infidelity were confirmed after everything was over. Turns out, I was one of 4 other students and his next-door neighbor, all of us in our early 20s. Looking back, it's not surprising, but at the time, I truly believed I was special to him. The summer after our breakup, while I was still finishing my degree, he either got fired, denied tenure, or was asked to resign from the university where we met. The last I heard, he had taken a teaching job at a much smaller college nearby. I have no idea what he's doing now, but for the first couple of years after I cut him off, he would still try to contact me. Restricted phone calls, messages on Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook. I think he even tried to apologize once, but I never read any of his messages. I just blocked the new accounts and moved on. If, by some chance, he ever reads this, I hope you're healthy and happy. I hope your children are healthy and happy. I hope you found peace, and most of all, I hope you never treat another person the way you treated me. Story 2. I was a senior in high school, and my English class had a very beautiful Latin female teaching assistant, as well as a cool, laid-back full-time male teacher. I was a pretty quiet kid that year, just focused on graduating and getting out of high school. I spent a lot of time drawing and writing, and I would always turn in work that seemed to catch her interest. She'd often ask how I came up with my ideas, and we'd talk about indie graphic novels. She was one of the few people who really made an effort to connect with me, and I appreciated that. A few weeks before Halloween, she asked if I could stay after class one day to discuss something with her. Since it was the last class of the day, I didn't mind. We sat down together, talking about some of the material I had written and books she thought I might enjoy. As the class ended, the teacher left, and soon it was just the two of us. I didn't really notice how close she had gotten until she was sitting right next to me, her jugs brushing against my arm. I couldn't help but notice that her chesticles was more noticeable up close than it appeared when she was wearing clothes. She then started asking more personal questions, saying that personal experiences could help with writing. As she did, I started to realize that her flirtatious tone and body language were signaling something more. She gave me a look that, now that I think about it, was definitely one of interest. She asked if I had ever had a girlfriend, and I opened up about how quiet I was at school because of a bad relationship and how uncomfortable I felt with everyone knowing my personal life. That's when she took my hand and said that life could be tough but wasn't all bad, and that I didn't deserve to be treated the way I had been. Then, she kissed me, and we continued until we heard a janitor approaching. She suggested I come to her place, and I agreed. Once we got there, things quickly escalated, and we ended up banging. It was an amazing experience, and after that, I found myself more attracted to women who had curves but were also fit, as she was. We didn't have a relationship, but we did become close, and our encounters continued for the rest of the school year and into my first year of community college, where I was finishing my general education credits before transferring to a larger university. We both had separate lives, but remained friends who were incredibly close. Eventually, she moved out of state to take a fantastic teaching job at a college with an amazing writing program. Now, years later, we're both married, but we sometimes think about meeting again as friends. We hesitate, though, because we're not sure we could trust ourselves alone together. She's still incredibly beautiful, and even though things have changed, I have a lot of respect for the time we spent together. Story 3. There was this insanely hot student teacher at our school, probably around 22 or 23 at the time. Does that count? I was 19, and I, along with pretty much every other girl in my year, had a massive crush on him. He was young, good-looking, and had this confident but easygoing vibe that made him even more attractive. It all happened at our graduation dinner. A few of us had smuggled in a bottle of passion pop, and after a few drinks, I was feeling bold. I casually told him I had always thought he was hot, fully expecting him to just laugh it off or give me some polite, professional response. Instead, he smirked, leaned in closer, and before I knew it, I felt his hands. The whole thing felt so sudden and electrifying, like something out of a movie. We still had about 3 weeks left before officially leaving school, and for the next week, we kept sneaking around campus, hooking up in random places whenever we could steal a moment alone. The thrill of nearly getting caught made it even hotter. Classrooms after hours, empty stairwells, even the staff parking lot once. We were reckless, and looking back, I have no idea how we didn't get busted. Eventually, we both knew it had to end. He was finishing up his placement, I was moving on with my life, and we left it as this intense but fleeting thing. We never really kept in touch, but every once in a while, I still find myself thinking about him, wondering what he's up to, and remembering just how wild those few weeks were. Story 4. During my college years, I had an affair with one of my professors. At the time, I was 19 or 20, and she was in her mid-30s. It all started when I visited her during her office hours to discuss a class-related matter. After we talked for a few minutes, I stood up to leave, but before I could walk out, she pulled me into a long, lingering hug. As she held onto my arms, she looked at me and said, "You give really nice hugs." Something about the way she said it felt more intimate than just a casual compliment. Sensing the moment, I decided to take a chance and asked for her number. She gave it to me without hesitation, and I left feeling a mix of excitement and curiosity. Over the next few days, we exchanged a series of flirty text messages, the conversation slowly becoming more suggestive. Then, one evening, she invited me over to her apartment under the pretense of needing help setting up a new TV she had bought. Of course, we both knew that wasn't really why she wanted me there. That night, one thing led to another, and we ended up sleeping together. What started as a one-time encounter quickly turned into a full-fledged affair. Over the course of the next few months, we met up regularly, finding moments to be together whenever we could. In total, we slept together about 10 times before she eventually moved away to take a new job at a different university. The relationship ended as quietly as it had begun, but it remains one of the most unexpected experiences of my college years. Story 5. I had a huge crush on one of my college instructors. I was just coming out of a really bad relationship, and I thought the best way to move on from that jerk was to get involved with this teacher. I pursued him pretty aggressively for weeks, inviting him to join me and the other students for drinks, wearing suggestive outfits to class, sitting provocatively, flirting, and so on, until we started sleeping together. He was in a relationship at the time, which made things more complicated. We kind of dated for several months, and he had this prestigious job at a major state government agency, which I thought was impressive. At one point, we even hooked up in his office overlooking the city, which was pretty cool. Over time, I developed real feelings for him, and that's when his other life, his relationship, began to weigh on me. He knew it was more of a fling than anything serious, and when he saw I was starting to want more, he gently told me that he didn't think we had a future. I was hurt, upset, and eventually, we stopped seeing each other. Looking back, I'm so grateful we ended things when we did. Shortly after, I met my amazing, loving, and perfect husband. If that fling had continued, I may not have met him, and my life would have turned out so differently. I'm incredibly thankful that he was honest and ended things when he did. It was exactly what I needed. He unknowingly set me on the right path, and I'm so glad he did. Story 6. I was 19, still in high school, and it was the first time my parents had left me home alone for a vacation. They had never trusted me before, but for some reason, this time, they went away and gave me the house to myself. I was out at a bar with some friends, having a few drinks, when I started scrolling through my phone. While looking at my agenda, I realized that I still had my French teacher's number saved in my contacts. She was 23 and had always been pretty chill with me since I was the only guy in her class. I figured why not. So I decided to give her a call and ask if she wanted to grab a drink sometime. To my surprise, she actually said yes, and we set up a time to meet. When we got together, we grabbed a couple of beers and chatted for a bit. After a while, she mentioned she was feeling hungry, and I suggested we grab some pizza and just hang out at my place, since I was home alone and had no plans. She agreed without hesitation, and we headed back to my house. At my place, we ate the pizza, drank a little more, and just hung out on the couch. We started talking more casually, and at one point, she said it was too late for her to head home. She casually asked if I had any PJs she could borrow, which I thought was a little strange, but went along with it. I grabbed something for her, and she started to change. But before she even got into the PJs, she kissed me. That was when things really took a turn. One thing led to another, and we ended up spending a lot of time together that summer, hanging out and getting closer in ways I hadn't expected. It was exciting, but it also felt like a strange, secret connection, especially since we both knew the situation was a little out of the ordinary. When school started again, she told me I could be excused from her classes, which was a weird kind of perk. I ended up passing the course with a B, which I guess was her way of making sure I didn't fail. After that, though, things went quiet. We never really talked again, and I never heard from her after the summer ended. Looking back, it felt like one of those things that happened quickly and unexpectedly, but it stayed in my mind for a while afterward. Story 7. When I was 23, I had a chemistry professor who was likely in her late 30s. One day, she messaged me through the student portal, asking if we could talk about a possible issue. I wasn't sure what it was about, but when we met, she asked me if I thought a couple of students had cheated on an exam. The conversation then took an unexpected turn as she started talking about music and other random topics, and we ended up chatting for over an hour. It felt like a light-hearted and easygoing conversation, nothing out of the ordinary, but I could sense there was something more beneath the surface. A little later on, she invited me to help with a birthday celebration for one of her students, and afterward, she asked me if I could give her a ride home. When we got to the parking lot, things took an unexpected turn, and we ended up becoming intimate. At the time, it felt like something out of a fantasy, exciting, secretive, and something I knew I couldn't tell anyone about. It was an experience that caught me off guard, but I couldn't help but feel thrilled by it. Over the next few months, we spent more time together. We even found ourselves running late for my final exam because we were hooking up in her car, trying to balance our private time with school. I think I ended up with a B+ on the final and an A in the course overall, which wasn't bad, considering the circumstances. Eventually, I decided to end things when I found out she was married and had a long-term boyfriend, neither of whom knew about me. It made me realize that what had started as an exciting secret wasn't something I could continue, especially given the complexities of the situation. I ended things, walking away with a mix of emotions and a bit of confusion, but I knew it was the right choice in the end. Story 8. When I was 19, still married, I fell in love with my art teacher in college. He was 34, also married, and when we first met, we ended up talking for hours. Our connection was instant. We dove into wild performance art together, and he even set up a painting station for me in his off-campus studio. One day, I was working on a self-portrait, wearing just my inners, when he played Keith Jarrett's Cologne concert. We started dancing, and he had been painting during the song. By the time the music ended, I was covered in his handprints. He had to help me clean up before I could go home to my husband. Later, I sat for a portrait, which I still have, and we would take breaks from painting to bang. It felt like a magical, almost surreal experience, like something you would read about in a book. Eventually, both of us divorced our spouses and got together. I was still a student, but after our relationship became public, I only had one class with him. The department chair allowed me to attend his classes, but I would report my work directly to her, and she gave me a grade. We lived in a small conservative town, and my ex-husband spread the news of our affair far and wide. I was shunned by friends, co-workers, and even my landlord, who treated me as though I were the War of Babylon. So, we made the decision to move to a new town and start fresh, without the weight of our past hanging over us. We spent 4 years together, continuing to make art, performing puppet shows, creating films and music. We laughed together every day, but in time, he left me. Now, I have a family, and that part of my life feels like it belongs to another lifetime. Still, certain songs and the smell of oil paint can take me right back to that time, reminding me of the intensity of that moment in my life. Story 9. It started off completely innocent. She was my chorus teacher, fresh out of college, and only about 6 years older than me. We had a natural rapport, She was young, easy to talk to, and had great taste in books, music, and movies. My brother was actually dating one of her high school friends, which made her feel even more familiar in a weird way. I used to cut class and tell other teachers I had a music lesson just so I could hang out in the music room with her. We'd sit around, talking about whatever, joking, just killing time. Then, the things started to shift. She began venting about her relationship a lot, how unhappy she was, how her boyfriend didn't appreciate her. She started asking for hugs more often, and I was more than happy to oblige. At first, it seemed harmless, just a way for her to feel better. But eventually, the hugs turned into longer embraces, then kisses, and before I knew it, we were making out in the music room when no one was around. Things escalated even further when she started offering me rides home after school. That's when we really started hooking up. I honestly felt like I had won some kind of secret lottery. Here I was, involved with my teacher, but I couldn't tell a soul about it. It was thrilling but also surreal, like I was living out some ridiculous fantasy. Then she started getting weird. She would openly ask for her hugs in front of the whole class, and I could tell people were catching on. I knew everyone knew. It wasn't just in my head. The looks, the whispers, it was obvious. I started distancing myself, riding home with my friends instead of letting her drive me. That's when she took it a step further. She just started showing up at my house. That led to one of the most awkward conversations of my life, with my dad. He 100% knew what was going on, but instead of freaking out, he just kept shaking his head, saying, "Damn, she's pretty." Like that was the only thing that mattered. I had no idea how to handle the situation. Ghosting wasn't really a thing back then, but I did my best version of it. I stopped answering her calls, stopped going to the music room, and avoided her at all costs. Eventually, she got the message. A few months later, I stopped by her classroom during what used to be our usual hangout time, and she apologized. She admitted she had been going through a lot with her jerk boyfriend and just wanted attention from someone who actually liked her. That was pretty much the end of it. We didn't talk much after that, and not long after, I graduated. Looking back, I'm beyond relieved we were never caught. It would have been devastating for both of us, especially for her. These days, we're still friends on Facebook, and she seems to have built a nice life for herself. She married a decent guy, has a beautiful family, and from what I can tell, she's happy. It's crazy to think about now, how reckless the whole thing was. At the time, it felt like the ultimate teenage dream. Now, it just feels like a story from a lifetime ago. Story 10. I started high school in 1998, and my teacher was a stunning 35-year-old woman. I had an absurd crush on her, but I never let her know. She'd always wear a provocative dress and sit on the empty desk in front of me in the front of the room. She caught me looking many times in the first few months and would just smile at me, and I'd smile back. After staying up all night on Sunday, I struggled to stay awake in class the next day. Noticing this, my teacher told me I'd have to stay for detention after school. Later that afternoon, when I arrived, I realized I was the only one there. I sat down and waited. About 10 minutes passed before she walked in and quietly closed the door behind her. She asked me to sit at the teacher assistant's desk next to hers, so I did. She perched on the edge of the desk and asked why I couldn't stay awake with her sitting right in front of me. I explained that I had been up all night, and she replied that it wasn't acceptable. She leaned in, and we kissed passionately, eventually deciding to hide behind her desk on the floor just in case anyone walked in. She asked me to come by every day after school, and we continued our relationship throughout the rest of the year. During the summer, we even met at the local mall parking lot for a few secret dates. She went from teaching the freshman success class to English, algebra, and later became my art teacher in my senior year. After my senior year, she told me she was pregnant, and then she stopped talking to me and disappeared. 18 years later, I still haven't heard from her. I don't view it as bad, as it was consensual. We were attracted to each other and acted on it. I definitely knew what I was doing wasn't right, but I didn't care. I still find myself thinking about those times with her and miss her a lot. Story 11. I had a massive crush on one of my grad school professors for over a year and a half. She was the total package, smart, beautiful, and completely captivating. I admired everything about her, and when I eventually went on to teach the same subject years later, I still used her notes and class materials with my own students. She was engaged at the time, so I never even considered the possibility of anything happening between us. It was just a harmless fantasy, something nice to daydream about. Then, out of nowhere, she called me. She said she was thinking about getting into yoga and knew I was into it, so she asked if I'd meet her for a drink to talk about it. At the time, I was pretty inexperienced when it came to hookups, so I genuinely took her at her word. I went into the evening expecting an innocent conversation about yoga, maybe a couple of drinks, and then heading home. That is not what happened. We got completely wasted. Somewhere between drinks, the conversation shifted, and before I knew it, We were making out in the middle of the bar. I was shocked, but not exactly in a position to stop it. Eventually, I walked her home, still trying to convince myself that nothing was actually happening. I kept repeating things like, "I'm sorry, this definitely isn't happening," and "I'll just get you to your door and go home." But despite all my half-hearted protests, it did happen. And the joke was on her, because what she got in return for crossing that line was a few seconds of the worst banging of her life, followed by me spending a significant amount of time in her bathroom, regretting all my life choices. The next day, she found me in the hallway, pulled me aside, and told me it was a huge mistake. She asked me not to tell anyone, though I doubt anyone would have believed me even if I had. I agreed, but honestly, I wish the whole thing had never happened in the first place. She went on to marry her fiancé and moved on with her life. As for me, I still had to finish grad school, and, as fate would have it, I ended up having to take a class taught by her husband before I could graduate. Story 12. I ended up dating a college professor for all 4 years of college. He added me on Facebook, where he posted his erotic poetry alongside pictures of him shirtless, and he had a killer physique. One day, I messaged him, telling him how much I loved his poems and how they were perfect for fantasizing. After that, he started sending me more personal poems, different ones from what he posted online, and eventually, he asked me if I pictured a specific person while fantasizing with his poems. I told him there wasn't anyone in particular since I was single at the time. He then asked, "What about me?" So, I ended up going to his house, which was just a short distance from campus, and we began hooking up almost every other day for the next 4 years. Throughout all of it, there were no special privileges for me as a student, and I didn't get better grades because of our relationship. It ended shortly after I graduated because I met someone else and started falling for them. However, every now and then, if both of us are single, we still hook up. Story 13. I'm not sure if this counts, but in my field, there's a mandatory internship period after graduating college and passing national board exams. During this time, each intern is assigned a perceptor, a licensed professional responsible for guiding them and teaching them the practical skills that textbooks don't cover, like hands-on techniques and state-specific laws, since school only teaches the national curriculum. The preceptor is often a supervisor or manager at the facility providing the internship, but technically, it can be anyone with a license in the field. Internships in my area are extremely competitive and incredibly hard to secure, so I started out doing grunt work at a facility, hoping to prove myself and earn a spot. My persistence paid off, and I eventually landed an internship with the firm's supervisor as my preceptor. He was more than a decade older than me, and because interns aren't allowed to perform any job duties without direct supervision, we naturally spent a lot of time together, working side by side on the same projects, following the same schedule, and even eating lunch together every day. After about 4 months, we returned from the holiday break, and, coincidentally, both had big personal news. He had officially filed for divorce. He had been contemplating it for a long time, but after talking with me about infidelity, he finally made the decision. His ex-wife had cheated on him twice, and he had proof. My news. I had broken up with my long-term boyfriend. Spending the holidays with my sister had made me realize how miserable I was, and after a much-needed big sister talk about what I was actually getting out of the relationship, spoiler, not much, I decided to end things. We both sat there for a moment, looking at each other, blushing slightly, before awkwardly returning to our lunch. What followed was another 4 months of tension-filled workdays, accidental brushes against each other, awkwardly timed love songs playing on the radio while we worked, Don't Stand So Close to Me by The Police, Caught Up in You by .38 Special, and Young Girl by Gary Puckett and the Union Gap all came on more than once at suspiciously perfect moments. The subtle, veiled flirting built up until we finally gave in and went on a date. Despite our growing feelings, we kept the relationship secret for the remaining 4 months of my internship. He was still my immediate supervisor and had a say in whether I earned my license, so we both knew we had to be careful. Once I officially got my license, we went public with our relationship, and shortly after, we both moved to a different firm. He was immediately promoted to management, and within a year, I was too. Fast forward 5 years, and we're still thriving at the new firm, married, homeowners, and expecting our first baby in just a month. So, in the end, mine turned out to be a love story with a very happy ending. Story 14. My college professor for religious studies. She was hilarious, brilliant, and had this way of making the class feel more like a conversation than a lecture. She often brought up her personal interests, which, coincidentally, aligned with mine, so we naturally had a lot to talk about. At first, it felt like our discussions were just extensions of class topics, but soon they shifted into more casual, friendly conversations about books, movies, and philosophy. Then, At some point, it became unmistakably flirtatious. The weird part? I'm also female, and I had never had feelings for another woman before. At first, I convinced myself that I was imagining it, that maybe it was all in my head, just some strange, fleeting fantasy I was overanalyzing. Fast forward to the end of the semester. I submitted my final exam at noon, and by 1 p.m., I had an email from her. I'm all done submitting your grades, so you're officially no longer my student. Congrats on passing the class, and good luck. Something about the way she phrased it, so direct, so final, gave me the push to test the waters. I responded with a song attachment, not something I'd normally do with a professor, and to my surprise, she replied almost immediately. That one email turned into another, and then another, and before long, we had gone from exchanging academic discussions to something far more personal. Eventually, we met up in person, which led to us hooking up, which led to a full-blown relationship that lasted 3 years. For about a year, we even lived together. It was a great relationship in many ways, but in the end, we realized we wanted different things long-term. We broke up on good terms, and now, 5 years later, I can say I'm incredibly grateful for the experience. It helped me understand what I truly want in a partner. Now, I have an amazing boyfriend, and as for her, I recently heard that she got married to a woman she started dating after me. Life has a funny way of working out. Edit. She was a religious studies professor, but not in the way you might think. My major was in religious studies from an analytical perspective, specifically focused on cults. At my university, religious studies was purely academic, meant for people interested in studying religion, not necessarily practicing it. She taught an introductory course on the philosophy of religious studies and wasn't personally affiliated with any religion or religious movement. Hope that clears things up. Story 15. Mine might not fully count, but here it is. I was 21, in college, and using OkCupid when I matched with this cute grad student. We really hit it off. Our fields of study were similar enough to make for great conversation, but different enough that there'd be no conflict of interest. So, we went on a date to a dive bar, had a few drinks, and hit it off even more. One thing led to another, and we ended up at her place for more drinks, and, well, more than that. A few days later, the semester started, and I found myself sitting in a statistics for people who can't do math class, and who walks in? The miss, let me lick wine off her melons. Let's just say, she had a very memorable, let's say, eccentric moment in our earlier hangout, but I knew I had to keep things professional while she was my teacher for the semester. Ethically, I couldn't keep hooking up with her during class time, but once the semester ended, we picked things up again. We hooked up a few more times, and honestly, it was just as fun as before. Story 16. When I was 19, I dated a professor from my university for a few months. He wasn't my professor, but he did teach some of my friends. We met totally by chance at a club one night, and at the time, I had no idea he was even a professor, let alone one at my school. It wasn't until a few days later, when we started texting, that I found out. He was ridiculously attractive, dark hair, bright blue eyes, and this effortlessly confident energy. He even told me that some of his female students would openly flirt with him during office hours, which, at the time, I found both hilarious and kind of hot. He was 33, not super old, but definitely a big age gap for me back then. At first, it was all fun. He was charming, intelligent, and had that whole authoritative, slightly off-limits appeal that made things even more exciting. But things took an unexpected turn one night when I was at his apartment. A couple of weeks into seeing each other, I casually asked to see some of his class materials, just out of curiosity. He thought it would be interesting to test me, see if I could tell the difference between a solid, well-argued essay and a total BS submission, even though I wasn't familiar with the subject. I was game, so I started reading. That's when I noticed something that immediately made me freeze. The BS essay, with the terrible grade, had my friend's name at the top. I looked up at him, wide-eyed, and told him. He was not amused. In fact, he was actually pretty upset, saying that it was a serious violation of student privacy for me to see someone's graded work. But honestly, I kind of loved it. Something about him dismissing my friend's essay as garbage and holding all that academic authority over his students played into the whole power dynamic in a way I found weirdly hot. He, on the other hand, was not enjoying the situation at all. Once he realized I actually knew some of his students, the whole thing seemed to lose its appeal for him. He became noticeably more on edge after that, and not long after, things fizzled out. It was fun while it lasted, but looking back, I think I enjoyed the thrill of it more than the actual relationship itself. Story 17. I had no idea she was my teacher when we first met. She was probably around 23 or 24, and I had just turned 19. That summer, I was in California on vacation, doing all the fun touristy things, Disneyland, California Adventure, the works. One day, I decided to go on the Winnie the Pooh ride, but none of my friends wanted to join me, so I went alone. That's where I met her. We hit it off instantly, just talking and laughing in line like we'd known each other forever. After the ride, we kept hanging out, and one thing led to another. By the end of the day, I was in her hotel room. We ended up spending the weekend together, meeting up whenever we could, and it felt like one of those whirlwind summer flings. When the trip ended, we went our separate ways, figuring it was just a fun, random connection. Then, the first day of the new semester rolled around. I walked into class, and there she was. At first, I was excited. I had no idea she even went to my school. I was about to say something when she suddenly walked to the front of the room and introduced herself to the class. That's when it hit me. She wasn't a student. She was the teacher. I could feel my stomach drop as she started the usual first day of school icebreaker, what we did over the summer. When it got to me, I barely managed to say anything before I noticed her face turning bright purple, like she was struggling to breathe. She knew. I knew. And we both knew we were so screwed. Story 18. My psychology teacher. I developed a crush on him, and he noticed. We started exchanging emails, which turned into phone calls, and before long, he invited me over in the evenings to watch movies. Before the semester ended, we started sleeping together. Then things got messy. He would avoid me unpredictably, break things off only to ask me back, and act secretive. I caught him lying about spending innocent time with other female students. Sometimes, he would ignore me for weeks, claiming he was busy, only for me to find out he was hanging out with others. Then, just as suddenly, he would spend weeks at a time exclusively with me. It was a cycle I didn't see coming. Oh, and all this after he freaking married me in secret. I spent 4 years trapped in a cycle of trauma bonding with him. He would reject me, then seem emotionally invested, sometimes pretending to care, and other times making it clear he couldn't stand me. Every time I tried to walk away, he pulled me back in. It was emotional torture, but I was too broken to leave for good. Over time, I spiraled into deep depression. My self-esteem shattered. I withdrew from everyone, feeling like a complete mess. And still, he kept stringing me along. It's been a year since we officially broke up, yet we still talk, prolonging the pain of rejection. I can barely sleep. Most nights, I cry myself to sleep, and every morning, I wake up in tears. I'm miserable, and some days, I wish I had never met him. But I know I can't keep living like this. I'm starting counseling soon because I need to find a way to move forward. Story 19. When I was 18, I had an experience with one of my college professors who was in his late 20s. We'd shared a mutual attraction, and after some time getting to know each other, we ended up at his house one evening. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and the experience itself turned out to be one of the most memorable and intense I've had. We both agreed that it would be a one-time thing, and I respected that decision. It was something personal, and we both moved on from it without any expectations beyond that. I never felt the need to tell anyone about what happened because it was consensual and a private matter. However, there was one moment that stuck with me. A few weeks later, while we were in a group of students on campus, he casually mentioned something that he had said to me in private during our time together. It was a small comment, but hearing it aloud in front of others caught me off guard. I remember feeling my face go bright red. It was an unexpected moment of vulnerability that made me realize just how much that experience had stayed with me. Story 20. During my college years, I found myself struggling with an art history class that focused primarily on ancient Chinese and Japanese art. The class was packed with so much information, and I was finding it hard to keep up. One day, I decided to ask my professor if there was any way I could do some extra credit work to improve my grade. She suggested I come to her office later that day to discuss it. When I arrived, we began talking more, and it became clear that she was genuinely interested in my art. Looking back, I wonder if she was just being kind, or maybe she was flirting with me. At the time, I didn't give it much thought. She was an experienced professor, and I was just a freshman. As our conversations continued, she invited me to her house, claiming she wanted to show me some of her personal art collection. She was in her late 40s, and I was 18, young and naive. I didn't think anything of it at the time. After all, she was a respected professor. When I arrived at her house, she told me she needed to change into something more comfortable. I waited for a few minutes, assuming we were going to look at some art or talk more about my work. But then, she called me into her bedroom. When I entered, I was stunned to see her lying on the bed in just her inners. It took a moment for everything to sink in, and as I looked back on our previous interactions, it dawned on me that I had completely misunderstood the situation. But I was happy to be wrong at that time. Story 21. When I was 17, I had a fake ID and decided to hit up a bar with a couple of older friends after a hockey game. We ended up meeting a group of girls and spent most of the night hanging out. One thing led to another, and I ended up going home with one of them. We hooked up, exchanged numbers, and I left the next morning without much fanfare. Fast forward to Monday, and I walk into my first period class at school, only to see the girl I hooked up with standing at the front of the room. She was the supply teacher. Her face was as red as an apple, and I just couldn't help it. I strutted to my seat with all the confidence in the world, feeling like Vince McMahon walking to the ring, knowing we both knew exactly what had happened. The awkwardness was thick, but I was definitely enjoying it. Story 22. I dated my senior year high school art teacher for 5 years. I was 18, and she was 24. It started because her class was during my lunch period, and none of my friends had lunch with me, so I would stay in the classroom to work on art projects and chat with her. We developed a friendly bond and eventually started hanging out outside of school, talking a lot on LiveJournal. That's how we got caught. The school was monitoring computer usage and started investigating why we were communicating so much. They gave her the option to either resign without any questions asked, or they would investigate further. At that point, we had only kissed, but she wasn't passionate about teaching anyway, so she chose to resign and pursue her real interests. After her divorce, she'd been in an unhappy marriage. We started dating. Our relationship lasted for 5 years, and for the most part, it was really great. The only odd thing about it was how we met and the circumstances under which we started dating, but beyond that, it was pretty normal. The relationship eventually ended when I was around 23 or 24, and she was 29 or 30. We'd both changed a lot over the years, and we realized it just wasn't working anymore. We're still on good terms though, and sometimes catch up over a beer. Story 23. He was my teacher in college, and I was an older student. He had just gone through a painful divorce, and I'd just gotten out of an abusive relationship. One night, we both ended up at a party, a little drunk, and flirted like crazy. At some point, he whispered in my ear, asking if I wanted to come home with him. We each took separate cabs to his place, and the night turned into something wild. We had so much fun, giggling, joking around, but it was also sizzling hot. Neither of us had ever had intimacy that felt so carefree and passionate. The next morning was definitely awkward, and class that week was even weirder, but it happened again the following month. It became a pattern, one that lasted almost 7 years. After I graduated, he wanted to go public with our relationship, but I wasn't ready. He was 18 years older than me, and the town was small. I didn't see a future for us that way. We ended things on good terms. At a gala, I found myself in his office after hours for the first time, and even though I wasn't a student anymore, it still felt a little ridiculous. Lots of shushing and suppressed laughter. I know he continued to pursue other students after me, but for me, at that time, it was meaningful. He showed me that I deserve pleasure and that it's okay to ask for it. We made each other laugh, and we kept everything very private. We both dated other people, but our hookups happened between relationships. Knowing that I had options and that I could call the shots gave me back a sense of power I'd lost. We still think fondly of each other, and I have no regrets, except for sometimes wondering what life would have been like if I had stayed. I'm glad I didn't, but it's nice to think about from time to time. I hope he's doing well. Story 24. When I was a senior in high school, I was in the AP English class, and I developed a strong connection with my teacher. We both shared an interest in Old English literature and manuscript art, which led to a lot of conversations between us. I was 18, and she was 38, never married, with fiery red hair that was even more striking when she took off her oversized glasses. I had a huge crush on her, though I thought she was unaware of it. I started hanging out with her during my lunch breaks and free periods, just chatting. Eventually, I offered to help her move some furniture out of her garage, and that was the turning point. She kissed me, and everything changed. We ended up in a 3-year-long intimate relationship, and I even changed my college plans to stay in my hometown to be closer to her. We traveled to Europe together, visited every museum we could find, and still had more than enough energy for each other. After I turned 19, I moved in with her, and I started thinking about asking her to marry me after I graduated. But then, tragically, she passed away in a car accident. A driver fell asleep at the wheel and swerved into her lane. I was devastated. I dropped out of school, fell into a deep depression. The loss tore me apart. Even now, I divide my life into before February 10th and after. Eventually, I pulled myself out of that dark place, went back to school, and met a wonderful, understanding woman. But I still haven't fully moved on. Sometimes, I'll hear her favorite song and break down into tears, reminded of the love and the life I lost. Story 25. I had a relationship with my high school English teacher. She was new to teaching, fresh out of college, and I was a senior. We worked together on the yearbook, me as the editor and her as the staff advisor. Our relationship was professional, built on mutual respect, and we spent a lot of time after school and on weekends working on layouts. This was before digital cameras, so I'd take the film to be developed and we'd sort through the best pictures. One day, A roll of her personal film got mixed in with the yearbook photos, and as I flipped through, I noticed some pictures of her at a party, hanging out with friends. I realized they were hers, and then I came across a series of photos where she was making out with another woman. She grabbed the pictures immediately, her face turning bright red. I smiled and reassured her, telling her not to worry about it, and I promised I wouldn't say anything to anyone. Given that we were in a Midwestern Catholic school in the 90s, I knew it could have ruined her career in a heartbeat. After that moment, she became more reserved and cautious around me, and there was an unspoken tension between us that never quite went away. As the year wrapped up, I graduated, and she announced she was moving out of state and wouldn't be returning. I still had a few final pages with graduation photos to submit to the yearbook company, and I needed her signature for approval. She invited me to her apartment to meet up. We sat quietly on the couch, not saying much, and then she kissed me. From there, everything happened fast. We ended up spending the afternoon together in her bedroom, and it felt surreal. It was like a release of all the unspoken feelings, stress, and passion between us. When it was over, we dressed, hugged, kissed one last time, and said goodbye. I turned in the yearbook and never saw her again. She moved to California, left teaching behind, and became an advocate for the homeless. To this day, I often wonder how she remembers that time and how she feels about what happened between us. Story 26. I dated a professor during my undergrad years. I met him when I spoke at an extracurricular event he supervised, and he was about 10 years older than me. A week later, I messaged him on Facebook, asking if we could meet up to talk about volunteer opportunities. It was a move that was probably a little obvious, but it worked, and we ended up kissing in his car. We kept things quiet for a couple of months, mostly meeting at his place or in a nearby town to avoid anyone recognizing us. Looking back, I realized that should have been a red flag, but at the time, I was just swept up in the intensity of it all. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and more than that, he made me feel mature and desirable at a time when I was feeling really self-conscious. Things took a strange turn when he ghosted me on New Year's Day, just hours before we were supposed to go on a date. Despite that, I still ended up seeing him whenever I visited town after graduation. Years later, out of the blue, he called me when he got engaged. He wanted my forgiveness, but mostly just to reminisce. Story 27. My story involves a guy from the administration at the school where I studied abroad. I was 19, and he was 28. He had just broken up with his girlfriend of 8 years, and a big group of us went out to celebrate a local holiday. We were drinking and ended up falling behind the rest of the group, and that's when he kissed me. He told me he thought I was flirting with him, but I wasn't. I reminded him he had a girlfriend, and he told me they had just broken up. From there, things progressed, but we had to be super secretive. We would book hotel rooms to hook up, and we almost did it in his office at the school, but that never happened. One funny thing was that I was the only student who was independently abroad. The rest of the students were on school-organized trips, so his boss told him to pay extra attention to me. The weird part, though, was that he was still obsessed with his ex. I get needing time to heal, but he kept referring to her as my girlfriend when talking about her. They even went on a trip together during this time, and he was convinced they were going to get back together. Of course, that didn't happen, but he still called her his girlfriend. Looking back, I can see I was just the rebound. We talked for a few more months, but then he ghosted me. I later saw that he unfollowed her on social media, so I guess she finally told him to move on. Now, I live in the same country as him and will probably be moving to his city for work in a few months. That should be interesting. Story 28. She was a late 30s community college literature teacher. I used to stop by her office every Tuesday and Thursday between a class that ended at 10:45 and the 11:30 class I had with her. 8 years later, I came across her on OkCupid and thought it would be funny to message her, asking why she didn't list hating on literature that people overanalyze in class as one of her 6 things she couldn't live without. She instantly recognized me and within a dozen or so messages, sent me her number. We were both recently divorced, and we spent the next 3 weeks talking on and off over the phone before deciding to meet up. The first time we met, she ordered us both a drink, paid, then suggested we leave the restaurant, grab takeout, and go back to her place. To make a long story short, we hooked up 3 or 4 times that night and kept meeting up occasionally for the next year. Eventually, things ended when she moved to Michigan for a new job. I hope life is treating her well. Story 29. During my senior year of high school, my English teacher and I developed a strong connection, and we flirted with each other throughout the year. After I started university in my hometown, I would visit her and attend her rugby games. Afterward, we'd often go out for drinks. In my sophomore year, she showed up at my dorm, drunk, after her team had scrimmaged on my college fields. We ended up being intimate, and it was an unforgettable experience. She was in an unhappy marriage at the time. Over the next few years, we kept our connection mostly physical, and our relationship was mostly about that. Eventually, she moved away, and we lost touch for a while. I got married, but years later, she reached out and invited me to visit her in her new town. When I arrived, she told me she was divorcing her husband, and we ended up being intimate again. Not long after that, she moved back to her home state, and I never saw her again. I later learned she passed away from breast cancer about 5 years ago. Looking back, I realized that despite everything, we truly cared for each other, and in some ways, I consider her to be my first and most genuine love. If circumstances had been different, I believe we might have ended up together. Story 30. When I was 19, I took an improv class at community college. For some reason, I became immediately drawn to the teaching assistant, who was in his 30s, and he seemed to notice. Although he wasn't my typical type for a regular relationship, there was an undeniable physical and emotional connection between us that was unlike anything I'd experienced before. After class one day, I found an excuse to offer him a ride home, and we ended up sharing an intimate moment. It wasn't anything too serious, but it was exactly what I had wanted. We continued to spend time together throughout the semester. Eventually, some classmates began to notice, and one of them sent me a message warning me about his reputation, advising me to be careful. I found it amusing, but also a bit shaming. I responded politely, assuring them that my private life was none of their concern and that I was comfortable with the situation. To me, it felt like we were both exploring and enjoying our connection. Nothing manipulative, just two people curious and in tune with each other. We stayed friends, and a few years later, I reached out to him with a request. I asked if he would be the one to take my V-card. It wasn't about romance. I just felt comfortable with him and was curious to explore more. The experience was positive and empowering for me, and it helped me feel more at ease with my body and confident in pursuing future relationships. He still reaches out to wish me happy birthday every year. Story 31. After graduating from high school, I moved to Goa and began my law studies in Bangalore. My English teacher from junior and senior years had always been a bit flirty with me. I first noticed when she accidentally referred to me as Deputy Hot Boy after I was selected as Deputy Head Boy. She was one of the younger teachers, in her late 20s, and I thought she was pretty cool. We often flirted when we saw each other, and I enjoyed our one-on-one conversations, especially since I was already excelling in English. But I knew that nothing could happen while I was still a student, not to mention the legal and ethical concerns. A few years later, after I graduated, I started law school in Bangalore. She quit teaching and moved on to study at Stanford before returning to Pune. We reconnected on Facebook when she created a book club with some of my former classmates, and we began talking again. I jokingly brought up her hot boy comment, and she admitted to having had a crush on me. Our conversations grew deeper, and we began chatting on Skype, where she became more open and playful with me. At the time, I was 20 and she was 32. She had recently broken up with her long-term boyfriend and was exploring her own personal freedom. We discovered that we'd both be in Goa at the same time. She was on vacation, and I was there for a debate competition. We made plans to meet, and one afternoon, we shared an intimate, passionate experience in her hotel room. After that, we lost touch, but she introduced me to online dating and the idea of exploring relationships with older women, which had already been a pattern I was interested in. A year later, I crossed paths with her ex-boyfriend at university as he had joined a postgraduate program there. We ended up competing for a spot on the debate team. Afterward, we shared a brief conversation where we both acknowledged the oddness of the situation, and that was that. Story 32. My story really began when I was 18. I had always been a bit different at school, something I didn't fully understand at the time. Later, I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was 24. My art teacher, who was in her 40s, took me under her wing. I think she felt some sympathy for me and also saw potential in my artistic abilities. I would visit her house, stay over, and help her with her exhibitions. She even included my work in her shows. Her boyfriend was also kind to me, and he seemed to accept me for who I was. Over time, things shifted. It started with small gestures. He'd place his hand on my knee while driving me home or make excessive compliments about my looks or the way I dressed. At the time, I was young, sheltered, and didn't fully understand that I had the right to say no. I had issues with authority figures and boundaries, so I would often follow their lead or whatever they suggested. After about 6 months, things took a turn. We started hooking up. I didn't feel comfortable with what was happening, but I let it continue. I was scared that if I didn't, I would lose both of them. He would sneak into my room when I stayed over, or take me out on drives. I'm still not sure if he told her or if she figured it out on her own, but one day, he kissed me right in front of her. I pushed him away, angry and confused. At that time, she was like a second family to me. My home life wasn't great, and she had become my closest friend. But she calmed me down and told me that everything was fine. That night, we all ended up sharing a bed. This continued for almost 4 years. Even when I went away to university, they would visit me. Looking back, there are many memories I still don't fully process, many of which are difficult and complicated. It wasn't until I was drunk and emotionally overwhelmed that I told my sister about what was going on. She told my parents, and they confronted them. That was the end of it. There's a lot more to the story, but that's the basic outline. For context, she was likely in her early 40s when it began, and he was 56. I know this specifically because my father and he had been friends from school, and they were the same age. Story 33. During my sophomore year in college, I got involved with a professor. I was 19, and he was in his mid-40s. I'd had him as a teacher during my freshman year. He was attractive in a mature way, and while strict, he had a charm and relatability that made him well-liked by students. He was a good teacher, but I didn't view older men in that light at all. When I signed up for his class in my sophomore year, it was because it aligned with my interests. I started to notice him staring at me from across the room, in a way that felt a little intense, but I dismissed it. After all, there were hundreds of students in the class, and he could have just been lost in thought. I started attending his office hours regularly, and he was always helpful, maybe a line or two of playful banter, but nothing that crossed any boundaries. Then one day, a friend or frenemy overheard a conversation in which the professor made some comments about me to another professor, saying things like, "I wonder what she's like in bed, and do you think she still had her V-card?" A month or so later, I received a message from him on OkCupid. It was lighthearted, something like, "Weird algorithm. Log off and work on your project, young lady." I wasn't sure how to handle it at first. It felt awkward, and I wasn't sure if I should ignore it or address it directly. In my infinite wisdom, I chose to respond, and it led to plans to meet up for coffee to talk about my aspirations in the field of academia. We started talking and seemed to connect. I remember feeling hopeful about my future. Somehow, things escalated, and I ended up at his nearby apartment. The questions he had about me were soon answered. Looking back, the whole situation feels so out of character for me. The physical side of the relationship was intense and pleasurable, but I also learned a lot about the field I wanted to work in through late-night conversations with him and watching him work. He even helped me find career opportunities that, while requiring effort, were hugely beneficial. The relationship ended a few months later. He became possessive and jealous of the attention I got from other men, along with other toxic behaviors that developed. We broke up, and I haven't shared this story with anyone. Sometimes I wonder how much of it was truly unhealthy, but it's a part of my past that I choose not to revisit too often. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.